Okay. On behalf of the Department of English at The Ohio State University, thank you for joining us for this English alumni panel on the medical humanities. I'm Dr. Katie Stanitz, the undergraduate program manager in the English department, and I'm going to moderate this panel. I'm thrilled that you're all here joining us for this to hear these fabulous two alumni talk about their career paths in medicine. We love to welcome all of our alumni back, and we especially love to hear what they've gone on to do since graduation. We always say that there's nothing you can't do with an English major, and I think that this panel is the perfect example of that maxim. And that's why we're delighted to have these panelists here to talk about their paths, how they got from their English B.A. to where they are now in medicine. And so before I introduce our panelists and talk about the flow of the event, I'd like to invite our department chair, Professor Susan Williams, to say a few words.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a delight to be with our distinguished panelists here and with all of you watching this. I appreciate everybody being here to talk about careers and medicine and humanities all together. I have been chair of the department since January, so I'm still new in my role. And one of the things that I like very best about being chair is getting to talk both to students and to alumni, and to have them together is a really wonderful thing, especially with one of my distinguished colleagues, Jim Phelan. I think increasingly that lifelong learning is what we're all about. I've stayed in the academy a long time because of that, but I'm really aware that every time we get alumni talking to each other, we're learning new things here at Ohio State because we hear things about what's going on in the world. And every time that I talk to students about their ambitions and what they want to do, I learn something. So I know I'm going to learn a lot listening to our panelists today. And I just appreciate everybody being here. And I want to say in particular, welcome to Dr. Prakash and Dr. Vaughn, because we are just delighted to have you in our virtual space and are looking forward to hearing from you. And thank you, Jim Valen, also for your participation, and Katie for organizing.
Thank you so much, Susan. So I'm really pleased to introduce our two alumni panelists here this evening. So with us are Dr. John Vaughn, who is the Director of Student Health Services and an Associate Professor of Community and Family Medicine at Duke University. He earned his BA in English and his MD degrees from The Ohio State University. He has worked in college health for over 13 years at The Ohio State University and Duke University, where he developed narrative medicine curricula at both the graduate, medical, and undergraduate levels. His main academic interest lies in the field of narrative medicine, specifically how the development of narrative competence informs and enhances medical education and provider-patient communication. His writing on the doctor-patient relationship has appeared in national publications and has been anthologized in a college-level composition and rhetoric textbook. He is the co-editor of the textbook Principles and Practice of College Medicine or College Health, and with Professor James Phelan, who's also here today, is co-authoring a new textbook, Narrative Medicine, a Rhetorical Rx. We also have Dr. Vidhya Prakash, who is a professor of clinical internal medicine and infectious diseases faculty member at Southern Illinois School of Medicine, Dr. Prakash graduated from The Ohio State University with a BA in English, and she received her MD degree from the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine. She completed her internal medicine residency, followed by infectious diseases fellowship at the San Antonio Uniformed Services Health Education Consortium. After serving as an infectious diseases physician in the United States Air Force for 10 years on active duty status, she retired from the military in 2014 and joined SIU School of Medicine. Dr. Prakash serves as Vice Chair of Clinical Affairs and Chair of the Clinical Competency Committee in the Department of Internal Medicine. She is founder and director of SIU's Medicine's Alliance for Women in Medicine and Science. Dr. Prakash serves as chair of the Health and Healthcare Committee, Illinois Council on Women and Girls, and is chair of the Illinois Department of Public Health Diversity and Healthcare Task Force. She is chair of the American Medical Women's Association Rural Health Committee, section of Diversity and Inclusion, and is also director of AMWA membership. She lives in Springfield, Illinois, with her husband, Dr. Eric Black, and their children, Eric Shiva and Ethan Prakash. Our alumni panelists are joined by Dr. James Phelan, who is a distinguished university professor in the Department of English, the director of medical humanities, and the director of project narrative. He teaches and writes about the American and English novel, especially from modernism to the present, present, nonfiction narrative and narrative theory. He is the first person in the history of the English department to be awarded both the Alumni Distinguished Teaching Award and the Distinguished Scholar Award. He's the author of 5 books that develop the contours of a rhetorical theory of narrative. The most recent are Living to Tell About It and Experiencing Fiction, Judgments, Progressions, and the Rhetorical Theory of Narrative. He edits Narrative, the journal of the International Society for the Study of Narrative, and with Peter J. Rabinowitz and Robin Warhol, co-edits the Ohio State University book series, The Theory and Interpretation of Narrative. So we are in truly distinguished company today, and I am so thrilled to learn from everyone here. So we'll begin with each of our alumni speaking about their career paths and how they got from their Ohio State English B.A. to where they are today, including how the English degree prepared them for and influenced their careers in medicine. Then Professor Phelan will join our panelists to discuss the interdisciplinary aims and outcomes of medical humanities work. After our panelists speak, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. I have some questions that were submitted ahead of time, so thank you to those of you who did. And we encourage attendees to submit questions here. To submit a question, please simply click the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and submit your comment or question. I will monitor them throughout the session. We may not be able to respond to every comment or question, but we'll do our best to address as many as possible. So thank you to everyone for attending, and especially to our panelists. And Dr. Vaughn, let's start with you. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Katie. I'm very excited to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to Ohio State students. And I'm very, after being all down there in those with all the Dukies down there in North Carolina, it's good to be talking to some Buckeyes again. But so as you said, I in terms of my journey to medicine, I started my undergraduate career at Ohio State, and luckily, Ohio State, you could major in anything and still apply to medical school. There wasn't a defined pre-med major, and so I thought, well, I love English and literature and stories, and so I thought I'll be studying science for my career. Let me study what I love in college, and it really worked out well, because as I went through, you realize that it's the stories and the communication and how people process their experience that's really the heart of medicine, more as much as the science. So it really worked out well, and it was just something that I loved, and I was able to luckily be at a place like Ohio State with so many resources that I was able to pursue both the English degree and the pre-medical curriculum. It was a challenge, it's in a sense, it was like a double major, because you did have to do all the science prerequisites as well as the humanities, and there might have been more overlap in some other science majors, but it was certainly worth it. So that's how I approached my career at Ohio State. And I would think one of the good news for the students here who are listening to this panel is that when I applied to medical school, and admittedly that was a while ago, I graduated college in '93. So, but when I was an English major applying to medical school, that's all anybody wanted to talk about. They couldn't believe they saw an English major. They were so used to the biology and chemistry majors that was a big talking point, and it was actually a real positive. And I think that's still the case. I think it's more common now to see humanities majors applying to medical school for sure, but it still shows a breadth of interest and background that is a very valuable commodity. Not the best word, but a valuable approach to schools of medicine more and more over the years. So I think for folks here in the panel who are considering a degree or a minor in English, I think it'll be a huge advantage, not just in terms of making you an attractive candidate to medical schools, but it will make you it will certainly inform your ability to be an effective healthcare provider in whatever field you go into. So, so storytelling has been a part of my career in medicine ever since I was in medical school. Someone told me when I started, you're going to see things that 100 screenwriters in Hollywood couldn't come up with in a million years. So I have a notebook of stories and powerful interactions and things that you see and learn. And I guess I was doing some journaling before it was called journaling, and helping me process my work in medicine. And that's something I go back to now, and certainly informed the work I do now. So I kept it with me throughout my medical training, and I was very fortunate my career path took a shift into college health, which is not something that I thought it would. I never intended to do that. I trained as a family physician and was doing primary care. And through various opportunities, it was an opportunity to come back to Ohio State and work in student health. And one of the reasons I took that path is that was an opportunity to be back on campus and hopefully be in an environment where I could work with experts, not just in the medical field, but also in the humanities and other areas, and try to develop some new ways of approaching medicine and delivering effective care to folks. And that certainly proved to be the case. When I came back to Ohio State, I was able to connect with Professor Phelan again, and we were able to go on to do some wonderfully fun and I think worthwhile endeavors here at the School of Medicine and at the undergraduate level. And it's continued to, and we're continuing to work together. It's been a career-long partnership that has really led to opportunities at multiple institutions and with other colleagues. And so that I've been very fortunate to kind of incorporate the narrative and the English major in a more formal way in my career. But I think that even if you're thinking of becoming a physician in private practice and not, working in academic medicine, a background in English and literature and humanities will be a huge value to you every time you take care of a patient and work with a patient or a family. So that's my approach that I've taken to my work now and continued to do. So I guess I'll leave the summary at that, and then I'm happy to kind of turn things over to Vidhya and then continue to talk to folks.
Great, thank you so much. I love that you were talking about, and we can talk about this more in Q&A, about how it was so unusual that you were an English major and that was actually like a bonus, that was a positive. And so I just love that, because I think it's contrary to what you might think too. So yes, I definitely want to talk more about that later.
Sure.
But thank you. So Dr. Prakash, I'd love to hear more about your journey now.
Thank you so much. And John, I really appreciate hearing your perspective. So I started college at The Ohio State University in 1996. I'm still so proud. My heart swells with pride every time I say the name of my alma mater. So I started in 96, and I had a deep passion for, like you, John, writing and literature and reading. But I knew I wanted to be a physician. I knew that was my calling. And I was very fortunate to attend an institution that honored both. I didn't feel like I had to choose. I was able to successfully complete an English major and, go through all of the prerequisite courses that were required for medical school. And I did so within 4 years comfortably. I didn't feel like I had to squeeze anything in. It all fit in very nicely. And like you, I think I stood out in the pile of majors where everyone was biology, biochemistry, zoology, chemistry. The English major really stood out, and the people who interviewed me were so excited, and the bulk of the interview was focused on my English major and books that I like to read. They really liked that. And I felt that going into medical school, I wasn't behind my peers. I did just as well as everybody else, because the curriculum, the math and science curriculum in Ohio State is rigorous and more than prepares you for medical school. And John, something that you said that struck a chord with me was, the heart of medicine on being a doctor is really all about humanism and connecting with your patients. So when I started out as a physician, I thought, okay, 90% of what I'm going to do will be based on everything that I learned in medical school. And, maybe 10% will help me as far as my English major goes. The farther I get into being a doctor, the longer I practice, I realize that's flipped. 90% of what makes my work valuable and gives it meaning is the human connection that I make with my patients. And I don't think I would have gotten there had it not been for my English major. I think one of my greatest gifts that I give to my patients comes from having been an English major, and all of the experiences that I had with such brilliant teachers at Ohio State. And I do a little bit of writing. I've been writing a little bit more about my experiences. They've been published on Doximity, which is a big online hub of medical professionals, where I talk a little bit more about my experiences. And I think mine is a little unique in that I was also in the Air Force, as Katie discussed. So I was an HPSP scholar between college and medical school. I attended training, and I actually did my medical training after medical school with residency and fellowship in the Air Force and served for 10 years on active duty. And I write about those experiences as well. So I don't feel I've ever quite lost touch with my English major. I read voraciously. I still like to write. And like I said, it has definitely made me the doctor that I am today.
Wonderful. I love what you said about that. I feel like I want to pull that quote out where the 90% of, what makes me the doctor I am is the like human connection. Like that's so wonderful. And it's nice to see too. I always like it when our panelists kind of find like these connections too, or those resonant chords in what they're saying. And so I'm excited for this discussion. So Jim, Professor Phelan, I would love to hear from you just about kind of, again, like more about the medical humanities. So like, what are the medical humanities and kind of what are we trying to do in the medical humanities here?
Right, sure. So first, I want to say that Vidhya and John are like great spokespersons for the medical humanities. I mean, the things that they said about the value of their humanities training and Vidya's point about the flipping of the 90%, 10% is the kind of thing that, I say, but, I'm not a medical, I'm not trained as a doctor, I'm just this English professor who, talks about books. So that's great. But in a little bit of a sort of more formal way, we sort of take those insights, right, and have built an undergraduate program and a graduate program at the master's level. And I'll focus mostly on the medical humanities minor. The idea for the medical humanities minor really is that we acknowledge the value and the enormous progress, really, if you look at the history of medicine from like 1920 to 1921 to 2021, the sort of scientific and technological advances in medicine are just, extraordinary, right? And so we acknowledge that and we think that's great. But at the same time, then we're saying, medical schools and medical training to a large degree, not, and it varies from place to place, but is so driven by the science and technology that other perspectives can get lost. And so what the medical humanities really is about is saying, okay, there are valuable perspectives offered by literary studies, philosophy, ethics, history, sociology, psychology, public health, that if we look at that medicine as a practice from the perspectives of these disciplines, that's going to enrich the understanding of people who go into practice medicine, right? And one of the specific things, and one of the ways that I work on, and it's connected with John, is this idea of storytelling, and storytelling as so fundamental to the encounters between patients and caregivers. And then so if you buy that, right, then it makes sense to say, oh well, if I'm going to go to medical school, I should learn something about how stories work, right? And that's where people like me come in. But I also want to say that medical humanities is more than just narrative medicine, right? The idea of thinking about medicine as a cultural practice, right? Thinking about attitudes, right? Why are people anti-vax, right? This is not going to be a question that you'll necessarily address from a scientific perspective, right? But you can address it by thinking about culture and subculture and discourse and the way they circulate, and what gets privileged in a group and all these kinds of things, right? So it's this idea that seeing medicine from a kind of multiple interdisciplinary perspective is a significant way to enhance the training, the preparation of anyone who wants to go to medical school, or even who's already been and wants to come back. So I'll pause there.
Great, thank you so much. I think that I love the interdisciplinary, like I said, the aims of that. Like, and again, my favorite thing about that is students sometimes say, you know, like, oh, well, medical humanities, like, what's that? And why is it in the English department? And that's one thing I love about our department is like its capaciousness, that it has these different things within it, and that our alumni too are a testament to like what comes out of that type of thinking and like that type of cross-disciplinary work. So I would love to hear more about, you know, from all of you about, especially too, like why these things, and I think you've all touched on it in certain ways, but I'd love to hear expanded upon of like why this English background is such a positive, like what it gives you that you might not otherwise have. Like, and I know, and some of it too is like, yeah, like there's not many English majors, but like what does that give you? Like, what I would love to just hear more kind of like texture to that.
So Jim and John, you both are big proponents of storytelling. So I'm going to share a story of mine to illustrate my point. So as you know, I'm an infectious diseases physician and I have a fairly busy practice. And I had a patient who I will call Mr. B, who had HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. And it required him to take medications, which he refused to take. He had not been on medications for the past 10 years, absolutely refused to take it. And so every visit I would have with him would be an argument between him and me. My trying to tell him that he needed to take his medication, otherwise he would die of this disease. And his telling me, no, I've been fine for the last 10 years, I don't need to take it. So during one encounter, it became very heated between me and Mr. B. And I was standing my ground and I was going into the gory details of every single infection that he would get if he didn't take his medication. And he stopped me mid-sentence. He said, you know what? You have split ends. So he pointed to my hair and he pointed out the fact that I have split ends. And so I was shocked. I was taken aback, you know, wasn't really expecting it. And I said, I do not have split ends. And he said, yes, you do. I am a hairstylist. You do have split ends. And I started arguing with him about the fact that I don't have split ends. He said, come over here, let me show you. So he made me turn around. I had a resident in training with me. He adopted her as his new pupil and started to go through the ABCs of bad hair using my hair as an example. So I'm at a point where I'm wondering what I should do. If I should keep arguing with him about my hair, if I should stand my ground and talk to him about his HIV. And nothing against science majors, but when I talked to my doctor colleagues who were science majors, guess what they asked me? What did you do? What did he do when you fired him? I would have just walked out of the room. You know, that the patient openly disrespected me, I would have walked out of the room. But how did the English major handle it? The English major put herself in his shoes. And who did she see when she saw him? She saw Joe Christmas from Light in August. She saw so many different characters that she had read about over the years in books. And she realized that this is somebody who may not have the trust required to really start taking his medications. And maybe she needed to do something to acquire his trust. So what did I do? I made a deal with him. I said, Mr. B, if I clean up my act with my hair, will you take your medication? He said, okay. And we shook on it. So the next several visits, we were beyond pleasantries. When I would walk in the door, we would nod at each other. We would not smile. I would quietly walk in, turn around, have him inspect my hair. He would give me my grade, and I would tell him what his viral load was. But most importantly, I started to get to know my patient. And for the first time in 10 years, he started taking his medication. And his HIV is well controlled. And I've established such a meaningful, valuable connection with him that makes my work so worthwhile. And so this is the value of my background in the humanities. My background in English is, again, it boils down to that deeply meaningful human connection that I make with my patients that I don't necessarily see as much in those who don't have that background.
So I could say something here, and John, I don't want to, but are you ready? No. So one of the things I would do, just build on, that's wonderful. That's just fabulous, right? And there's this power of storytelling right there with Vidhya's story. But to be a little bit more formal about it, right? I think one of the things that we can do is sort of think about sort of the knowing how and the knowing what that we get from our English major, our English, experience, right? So, and they are interconnected, right? And I think Vidya's story it shows that, right? So that, knowing what, well, I read Light and August, right? I had a reference point there. It's sort of, and also because I did that, right? I got practice in adopting the perspective of others, right? And you see the interconnection there, right? I know Light and August, but I also know what it's like. I have the skill of being able to adopt somebody else's perspective, right? I also think that, work we do in terms of writing and, analysis develops skills for problem solving, for seeing complexity, but not being paralyzed by it, right? And being able to make some decisions. And John and Vidhya could talk, much more knowledgeably about the way in which medicine sometimes falls into this idea of kind of, symptoms in, algorithm for treatment, treatment plan out, right? But I think that the kind of, and I think that can be valuable, but I think that the kind of skills and knowledge that an English major provides, adds another layer to that, right? So you're not only dependent on that sort of algorithmic approach.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a great story. I wish I had enough ends to be split, but I guess I'm going to have to, I'll have to take your word for it. But no, and that's it. That is a great story, and it says something that's really fundamental, but often gets overlooked, is that if the people you're caring for don't trust you or feel like you're not listening to them, you can have the miracle cure, and it won't make a difference. And I'll tell you, doing this, working with medical students both at Ohio State and Duke, you wouldn't believe the stories that students have seen of patients in the hospital, who are not, who won't take life-saving treatment, literally chemotherapy and things like that, because they feel like the team wasn't listening to them and didn't understand why they were saying things. And it's not just feel good, as one of my medical colleagues say. This is, narrative medicine and medical humanities. It's not just learning how to hug our patients better. It's about learning how to take care of people. And I think you're absolutely right, Vidhya, that that having that perspective and that ability to see in others perspectives and points of view is integral to this, especially in the world we live in today, where issues of identity and diversity and inclusion are so, it's so important to everything we do. But without these kind of fundamental skills, in terms of true empathy, being able to see other people's point of views, how they process the world, the most basic care can't occur. And so, and I feel like there's a connection there that is just so important. And the science is never easy, I mean, certainly, you need to know the science, but I'd say that 90-10% flip that you talked about, Vidhya, is absolutely true. In most situations in healthcare, what the medical answer, the scientific answer is pretty well established, but it's the situations that there are no answers for, the people, the background, the cultural implications, that if you can't navigate well, you're not going to be able to provide care. And frankly, Jim mentioned anti-vaxxers as an example, but this is why so many people have gone to alternative healthcare providers throughout history, is that traditional medicine has not been good at recognizing the point of view and the power of those the narratives that people tell themselves about their health and their experience. And so it's just absolutely vital to providing the care. I think it's a great story.
One of my favorite quotes is, people don't care that you know until they know that you care.
Absolutely.
I think, I mean, I just want to echo, that was a wonderful story and so beautifully told. And thank you for sharing that with us. I mean, I think it's about, you know, as Jim says, it's not just this kind of one way, like one option of looking at this. It's about really thinking about not just bodies, but about people. And you know how we treat people, not just disease. And so I think, you know, like you said, in hearing too, that that's not necessarily something that everybody can do too, that that's actually a skill, that that's a real skill that needs to be developed, and that and can be developed by this type of, you know, by this type of learning, and this type of curriculum. And so kind of on, I guess, like that type of note, I was curious about one of the questions that was submitted was for people who are interested in attending medical school, or for someone who, I think this student was accepted, congrats to that student. How would you recommend incorporating English or medical humanities into your studies? Or for someone who's in early med school, like how would you, or, you know, pre-med, how would you recommend doing that? And what do you think would be useful to those students?
It's a great question. Well, now, thankfully thanks to the work of Professor Phelan and folks like him, there's formal ways to incorporate the English into medical training. Many programs, academic programs, have narrative medicine programs, and as Jim said, it's more than just narrative medicine. There's medical humanities. Even when I was at Ohio State in medical school 20 some years ago, there was an element of getting together with residents and other students and looking at patient stories. So there's formal ways to do it, certainly. There's resources everywhere for that. But I really think, and this is an interesting point, because when I remember that one of the first classes in narrative medicine that Jim and I taught together, one of our medical students said how, and this you'll hear from a lot of physicians, so we don't have time for that story stuff. Like, you know what, I got 10 minutes to take care of this patient. I don't want you to go in that room and spend all this time getting their whole life history. But you know what, I've really found that it doesn't take that much. It takes, it could be as quick as asking them about their hair that we just learned about, and so I think this is not just feel good stuff. There are skills to be learned. There are things you can do, so you can use that in your work in pre-med. When you're volunteering or working in the hospital, go back and spend 10 minutes sitting down and talking to someone and say, what are you worried about? I'll tell you, those 5 words have solved so many problems for me over the years with patients who aren't happy or who aren't getting what they need. Sometimes physicians are afraid to ask them because they think it's going to open up a can of worms. And I think early on in your medical education, if you get comfortable with that and saying, asking that question, and it doesn't have to take a long time, start thinking about stories about, is your patient telling themselves about this situation, and how is it different than what you're telling or what your attending is telling you. And you can start doing that as an exercise, from the first day of medical school, you can do that. And it'll make you a more effective clinician. I strongly believe that. So I think that's a good way to start that.
I agree with your points, John. I think those are really excellent points. I will be honest. So it depends on the type of medical school you go to. The medical school that I went to, the first 2 years was all in a classroom. We really did not have any interactions with patients. Patient care started in 3rd and 4th year. So we were very immersed in clinical rotations and talking to patients. And I love your point, John, about the lost art of listening. We as physicians have stopped listening. We are focusing all of our energy on diagnostic tests and x-rays and lab results to make our diagnosis, when one of my best teachers in medical school told me, your answers are in front of you with the patient. 90% of the patient's history is what's going to cinch the diagnosis for you. You don't really need to rely on much else. Taking the time to sit down and listen and not interrupting, listening for understanding, is what's going to make you the best physician possible. And so I echo your comments, and I think it's an important one, the power of listening. We must listen.
I could just talk a little bit about Ohio State, and then, I think Vidya's point about it depends on the kind of medical school you go and what sort of opportunities are and what your demands on your time are. But at Ohio State, there's currently, I think, 2, sort of formal ways to incorporate this. One is a course called literature for physicians from the page to the bedside. And John and I were instrumental in getting that off the ground, along with a medical student who really was sort of proposed the idea. And I could talk more about that if people were interested. Right now, there's a group of first-year medical students who are working on developing a kind of certificate program that would take some of the courses in our MA program and set up sort of requirements for take a certain number of them and so on. And this would be a way of sort of supplementing your medical school training without sort of stopping out and doing a whole degree or something like that. And then the third way would be to pause and come at Ohio State, you could pause and come to the MA program. And we do have a med student who's doing that now. And he was a philosophy major as an undergraduate, so pursuing the humanities.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that so much of what you're saying is that it's things I think we take for granted as skills. Like listening. Oh, I can listen. I know how to listen, or asking questions, and asking the right questions. It's like, oh, well, I know how to ask questions. And I find myself doing this, but it really is a skill, and it is something you have to develop. It's something you have to practice. And so I think just the reminders that these things are, muscles that we have to work. We have to work at these things, and that they are things you have to develop, that you have to practice, that you have to think about, that actually require critical thinking and analysis. I think is just a really important reminder to us all that, these are not things that we should take for granted as being able to do. So thank you for that. A kind of related question about, thinking about your English degree. Someone asked, was it difficult, or how difficult was it to manage kind of extracurriculars or research, or just doing all of the prereqs? I know, Vidhya, you mentioned it wasn't difficult, but just a little more on this of being an English major, but also doing all of the pre-med prereqs and I'd also be interested. So there's the one side of that of how difficult was it, or how did you kind of balance all of that? But I'd also be interested in knowing too of how you saw those things coming together, or if you saw them as pretty separate while you were doing it.
I'm happy to take that. I found it maybe a little more challenging than Vidhya did, because I was, as an English major, I was worried about that in terms of having the science to get in and to get into medical school. So what I actually did was I was able to finish in 4 years as well, but I had to go through summers, and luckily I had that high school Latin credit to get me out of my foreign language requirement. That was the way I was able to get through in 4 years. And this is something I have told medical students in the past, is that as an English major, I felt, okay, I'd gotten into medical school, I was starting in the fall, and I felt, well, man, these biochem majors are going to just, really be running out of the gate, and I'm going to have a hard time. So I actually did a pre-entry kind of program, an intensive 8-week program to, get myself ready and all that. And, looking back, I might not have done that because I felt like I never got a break, and I kind of rushed in. So I know when you're looking at the beginning of a medical career, you think, oh, it's 4 years of medical school and at least 3 years of residency, and it's so long. But I would say, take that, take the time. The time goes, in the scheme of things, an extra year or 6 months won't make a difference. And to do that, to kind of keep yourself better balanced. That's a good question about, how to balance extracurriculars and research. I would say you can certainly do both, and luckily now, since this area of inquiry is a little more advanced, you could do research in the field of medical humanities, and that counts as research for when you apply to medical school. So, I mean, Jim started, the entire master's in medical humanities. It's a formal academic curriculum, and that kind of work, especially in other areas of healthcare, it's not just bench lab research. So, you can incorporate it in that way. So I think there's plenty of opportunities to do that, but it is a lot of work, but I think there's ways for you to do that. Maybe Vidhya, you have a better perspective on that than I do.
No, I agree with the fact that, I had to take summers too, John, to take classes, and I used summers to volunteer at the hospital and do research. I really had to keep my eyes open for those opportunities. They did not fall into my lap. I really had to do a lot of the legwork to get those opportunities, but it was worth my while. And none of it seemed like work. So my peers would say, oh, why are you working during the summer? It was all stuff I loved to do. I was passionate about being a doctor someday. So volunteering at a hospital was not work for me. Going to a research lab was not work for me. Taking a creative writing course during the summer was not work for me. It was a joy. So, you know, like you said, I think it is doable within 4 years to take pre-med and English courses and volunteer and do research. It really is about budgeting your time wisely.
Yeah, thank you. And I always say, tell the students, you know, talk to us in advising too. Like, we're always happy to help you figure out. And there's so many resources, especially at a place like Ohio State, where there's so many resources to help you with exactly that, with that kind of planning and with that kind of time management. Like, so I would just say to students, come ask us. We're always happy to help. That's what we do. That's my favorite part of my job, is helping students. Okay, not writing all the emails. Unless the emails are in service of helping students, then I will do it. So yes, the second half of that question. So like, I'm just curious about this, because I do see them, and I think a lot of people do, is so separate, like doing the prereq work for, you know, for the MD, and then doing the English degree. And so I'm curious if like, and so now both of you clearly like see them as very, very much coming together. I'm curious if you saw that as an undergraduate, or if that was something that kind of came to you later, if you always saw like that's, you know, or if it was like, oh, I love English and I want to be a doctor, or if it was like, oh, these two things really come together, if that question makes sense.
Go ahead, Vidhya.
Yeah, you know, I think when I was going through undergraduate, I saw them as separate. I will be perfectly honest with you, because I had no experiences with patients at that point. So I had no idea how important it was going to be. And I honestly saw my English classes as a welcome respite from organic chemistry and physics, because I see myself as much more of an English brain than a science and engineering brain, to be honest. So that's my perspective, to be honest. I don't know, John, if you have a different perspective.
Oh, we must be related, because I was exactly the same. I looked forward to my English classes. Denny Hall was an oasis of joy in the midst of organic chemistry classes. No, and that's a great point. I'm glad you asked it, Katie, just because even from logistical things where the science courses tended to be on the other side of campus, so to get back and forth, you know, it didn't really feel like separate worlds. So no, I think that perspective of how closely intertwined English and medical and humanities are with medicine it's easier to see now than, but when you're in the thick of things as an undergraduate student, that's the nature of the undergraduate experience, is that you're not, I don't think it's going to be as easy to see that. So absolutely. But hopefully now, by having conversations like this, you can maybe find a way to do that. But the reality is it is kind of, you are working in two separate worlds now. Once you get into medical school, those worlds start getting closer and closer.
Just a footnote that may be of some interest. The pioneer of the narrative medicine movement, Rita Sharon, trained as an internist, went into medical practice, but she always had this love of literature, and particularly of Henry James. She was at Columbia. She went over to the English department and said, you know, could I get a PhD? What would it take? And they encouraged her, but she thought of it the whole time as just this separate thing. I'm pursuing this other thing that I really care about. It was only after she finished the PhD that she started to say, you know what? These two things actually can inform each other in a powerful way. So.
And that's what I find so interesting, because I think back about, I mean, just in my own experiences, and I think when you're so close to something, you can't see the whole picture, you know, and it's so difficult. And so that's why I asked that, because that's what I would, you know, that's what I would think. Because when I was, you know, doing coursework in undergrad, and I was nowhere near doing any of this, I didn't see the way that things would unfold, you know, the way that they do 5, 10, 15 years later. And so, and I love that. Like, I always tell our students that English is a timeless degree in some ways, that it's always something you're going to be pulling from through your career. And so it's really cool to see the ways that, like, even when they seem so separate, they actually start to merge later on in your career. And so I also think, John, that that might be the only time that Denny Hall has ever been referred to as an oasis, but I'm glad that it was. So in terms of other kinds of medical humanities paths, I'm curious. So both of you obviously are, physicians, but we had a question about other career paths in medical humanities, and I was curious about if you had any kind of ideas about potential career paths, especially for English graduates, or really for anybody interested in that path. And I know, and Jim, I'm sure you could speak to this as well.
Sure. Well, there's all kinds of neat overlaps between humanities and medical careers. There are people who are medical writers, who make a career, who don't go to any formal medical training, but have, wonderful careers translating, complex scientific concepts for people. And that's as valuable. It's extremely valuable. There's medical illustration is a field that people go into. I know it's not English, but medical humanities, those kind of fields, and you can see how that overlaps. There are courses at certain medical schools where dermatology professors will take students to art museums and look at paintings and for analysis and things like that. So I don't know if that's really answering your question, but I do think Jim mentioned this early on, the pace of medical knowledge, scientific knowledge, it's beyond the ability for one person to just kind of keep up with. And so that ability to especially with new media and new technology, for young folks like you sitting on this webinar, to take those skills of being able to analyze anything from a tweet in 140 characters to an academic paper and translate that in a way that can be meaningful to people, there's a huge value in that. And so I think there's, you don't have to go to medical school or nursing school to use this kind of area and expertise to really have a big impact on public health, medical information. And believe me, and this is one of the things I've always said about English majors. The old joke was, what are you going to do with your English major? Wait tables or work at Starbucks? But I'll tell you, the average person cannot communicate through the written word very well. If nothing else, if you have that ability to do that, you will always have a place in all kinds of corporations, nonprofits, anywhere where you can put those skills to use to really convey information. So there's really limitless opportunities, I think.
I will just add, at Southern Illinois University, we have a combined MD-JD program, and our MD-JD program is closely linked with the Department of Medical Humanities because of the amount of writing that's involved. So just another interesting career path that one could pursue as an English major.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, I think if you think about medicine as a broad field of potential employment, right? Not just, becoming a doctor or a nurse, right? There's so much, there's so many opportunities, so many kinds of positions, from foundations to government agencies and so on, that are dealing with the healthcare system, right? And this kind of preparation, I think, is very valuable in many of the same ways, although not all of them, right? Some skills become more salient in particular areas than others, but the general kind of preparation, I think, is very valuable.
I completely agree. And just to your point, John, about how written communication especially is so important, the National Association of Colleges and Employers, NACE, does all this research on what employers are looking for. And one of the top things is always written communication. And so I always tell our English majors, you have that in spades. There are so many people who, and I'm sure you bet some in your science classes or in your STEM classes who were like, oh, you're going to write a paper? Ooh, And so I know that, at least from my own experiences with my STEM friends in college. So I think that that's just such a wonderful thing to be able to have, is that kind of fluency in that. And so that's really wonderful. Just to, I have some more questions, but just FYI to everybody there, reminder, Q&A, if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A section, write them out. So another question we had was, if you weren't a doctor, what other career path would you have chosen, do you think?
I don't know. I tried to follow Jim into the MBA, but I didn't have the skills for that. So, that's a good question, because let me tell you something. Physicians as a group, we take complaining about our jobs to Olympic levels. So there's always that question, well, yeah, okay, well, fine. What else would you do? And I think from my perspective, sitting back, not just because we're on this kind of panel, but I think I would try to, do something in writing, the dream to be a sports writer or something like that. But really, it's the stories that are what's interesting about so many things in life. So I don't know. I would try to maybe incorporate some kind of career in writing. I don't know. What do you think, Vidya?
Yeah, I would say either writer or lawyer. It's interesting because since I was a kid up until the 10th grade, I swore I was going to be a lawyer. And then I took an anatomy and physiology class and totally went towards medicine. So if it weren't for medicine, I think I probably would have been either a writer or a lawyer.
Wonderful, thank you. And yes, just so for those of you who don't know, Professor Phelan actually was a basketball player in college. And there's an excellent obsession story from him on the website that I definitely recommend you read. So that wasn't just a joke, that was real. Great, thank you. So Vidya, you had mentioned kind of looking for opportunities. And so we had a question about networking. And so again, and connecting with kind of potential mentors or getting experiences or opportunities. And so I was wondering about, from kind of all three of you, if you have ideas about this, about advice for networking for students who are interested in medical careers or in medical humanities careers.
I would say I made this point before, don't wait to be approached. You have to do the legwork. You have to be reaching out. And I think low-hanging fruit is your professors. So professors in science classes, just walking up to one of them after class and asking, do you know of any research opportunities? Are you seeking a research assistant in your lab? Really opens a lot of doors. So I would say that that's probably the easiest way to connect with, or make yourself available for future research opportunities.
And I would piggyback on that. I think Vidya is absolutely right, but I also want to acknowledge how hard that is to do when you're an undergraduate student and how intimidating it is to go up and talk to your professor. I look back and go, man, if I had, why did, all these people are here to, I was afraid to do it, or, so, and Vidya's absolutely right. And it is hard to do, but, give yourself that, that's what you're in a place like Ohio State for. And when you're in that stage of your career, that can be really intimidating. But that's one thing. If I could go back in some ways, I would be much better at that. And I will tell you else, being a student is a very valuable commodity when it comes to that kind of networking. If I call someone and say, hey, I want to talk to you about this, okay, maybe. But when a student does, you guys have a power as a student to do that. When Jim and I taught our From the Page to the Bedside, the medical student who started the class with us, she said, oh, I'm going to invite the president to the course, and like, we'll just do that. And if I had submitted a request to the president's office, it would have been 14 layers of bureaucracy. But the president showed up because it was a student. And so recognize that,
I thought it was because of being you.
Well, it was you, Jim. You are a big deal. That's true. That helped. But my point is, as busy as like Ohio State, as big as of a place as it is, and as busy as people can be, they're here. They're here for the students, and it sounds like a cliche, but it's not. And as a student, you have the ability to walk into a place or call someone or talk to someone that you won't have as later on. So take advantage of it. And there are networking opportunities that that might not even exist until you start a conversation. Then you'll create something. So again, just acknowledging that that's hard to do, but if you can take that first step, you'll be amazed what it could open up for you.
And at OSU now, there is an undergraduate organization called Humanism in Medicine. And Julia Nelson Hawkins from the Classics Department is the sort of faculty director. And she's wonderful, very enthusiastic. You could approach her, just send her an email and say, oh, I heard about this thing, what do I do? And she'd take it from there.
Yeah, I really, really want to echo just ask, because the worst thing they can say is no. And at that point too, then you didn't have the opportunity before, so it's fine. But yeah, I mean, really, honestly, like this is the time and a place to ask and see what happens. I know that's how a ton of opportunities happen. And also, if you ever have questions about this, so to John's point, like it can be really intimidating to ask a professor that. You can practice with me. Come talk to me. I'm happy to talk with you about this. I am not going to say no to practicing with you. So you already know from that. So come talk to me about that, about how to approach professors to talk about this kind of stuff. I can give you some sample language to help with that. But please do ask, because really, honestly too, I would say a lot of people are really excited when undergraduates especially show interest in their work and want to pursue that more. So I want to just completely echo all of that. And I'm really glad that that was something you guys all said. So thank you. All right, so we had a few questions come in the Q&A. So was there any kind of backlash from your parents or relatives who might have doubted your choice to become an English major, especially before going to medical school? I know that this is something some of our students might, actually it was something I experienced, although now they're very pleased. So, you know, so it gets better, everybody, with the English major stuff. So if you did, how did you kind of deal with that in those kind of discussions?
I will say my parents were very supportive and actually delighted that I was going to be an English major and also pursue a career in medicine. They supported me all the way. I think I got a lot of curious looks from peers, you know, classmates as I was going through college. And there came a point where it got a little exhausting to have to explain it over and over and over again, because you do get used to having to explain it. But, you know, in the end, well worth it.
Well, my father was a professor of classics and my mother has a master's in English. So they were actually disappointed when I went to medical school. They said, why did you stay in the humanities? No, but I think and maybe I'm making an assumption here, but that question I think is getting at something important. And as I've seen later on in my career as a college health physician working with students who face that, my parents want me to go to medical school or law school, but I want to be a visual artist major, and it's a very, very, very stressful situation for folks. And I think so. No, I personally did not have that interaction, that experience with my family, but I do think, I think from now that I have children and I'm on the other side of it, I think where the parents' pressure comes from that is, they want you to be able to take care of yourself, and they may not understand what something as nebulous as English or humanities is compared to a more formal career. So having that conversation early on, I think, especially if it ends up with you working in a medical career, your family should be pretty happy with that. So, but that's a good question, and it's a tough one to answer. But I think if you can make that case that this path will lead to many opportunities to make valuable contributions in different ways, you can navigate that well.
Absolutely. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I think too, there is a small kind of shift toward a greater valuing of humanities applicants by medical schools. Mount Sinai in New York is sort of, they say we want humanities majors, right? We don't want the chemistry majors. And I think, at OSU, this is an emphasis, not to say only humanities majors, but it's looked at as a potential positive. And I think it's slowly beginning to happen across the country.
Yes, and we have a question that actually kind of goes with that, but I would say prior to that, just English majors, if you do want to talk about different career options, medicine and the medical humanities or not, please come talk to me. I offer career advising for all English majors, and I'm happy to talk about how to make the best kind of career choices and think through that for you individually. So come talk to me. But yes, Jim, actually, that's a really great point about kind of what medical schools are looking for with the humanities. And so we did have a question about, are all medical schools, and I know you might not be able to answer this, looking for English majors as well as STEM majors? Like, are they kind of putting them on equal footing, or do some medical schools kind of prefer STEM over English, and sort of what your experience of that might be?
Yeah, I don't know, right, to really give a well-researched answer. But I do know that Mount Sinai has flipped it, right, to say, humanities. I will also mention that one of the things that's going on in Ohio, and sort of an Ohio State-based initiative, is that this May, we are having a one-day conference at which we are inviting admissions directors from medical schools in Ohio and trying to sort of make the case for the value of, giving, maybe not giving equal status, we'll put it that way, to humanities majors. It's a kind of consciousness raising thing. And in fact, some of my former students in the undergraduate narrative medicine course have agreed to be on a panel to talk about it. One of whom is already accepted to a medical school in Ohio. So that's a nice success story.
I think that's a great initiative, Jim, really, and so important. And I hope it becomes global. I really do. I'll be curious to know how it goes.
Yeah, just another footnote to that. It's sort of, we have some funding for it, and it comes from a man who was a history major as an undergraduate at Ohio State, went to Ohio State Medical School, became an ophthalmologist. He also got a JD and so on, but he came back and he said, it was my history training that I relied on more than my medical training. And, I don't think I'm the only person, who has that kind of experience. And you guys are testifying that that's true. He's not the only one. And so he really wants to say, all right, well, what can we do to sort of raise consciousness and, change behavior?
That's really cool, Jim. I didn't know about that. That's a great project. I will say, so I actually do interviews for Duke Medical School. Okay, so I get a good sense of the applicants and who are getting in. And boy, I'll tell you, you guys are so impressive. I wouldn't get into high school nowadays compared to what you guys get into medical school nowadays. It's really amazing. But one, I think there have been some. Yeah, like Jim, I can't answer what every medical school looks for, but I think there is a shift, and one of the biggest ways is the MCAT, the college, the medical college entrance exam. They changed the format to prioritize some of the humanities, not taking away necessarily the focus on the sciences, but putting more of a focus on that. That's a significant shift, and I think that's representative of what a lot of schools of medicine are looking for. And a quick side note. Duke, when we do the medical school interviews, it's called a multiple mini interview, and we have 10 applicants come in at a time, and they do 10-minute stations, and they go from station to station. And the majority of the stations are actually ethical scenarios that a student has. You get 2 minutes to read the scenario, and then 8 minutes to discuss it with the person interviewing you. I mean, if that isn't narrative medicine, I don't know what is. And Duke is a big-time medical school, and that's what they're using to determine who they're going to bring into their program and what they want. It's not about knowing the science. It's about, can you see different points of view? Can you formulate an argument as to why you choose one side or another? So it's formalized into the heart of medical education nowadays, in terms of even to the point of who gets in. So I think you can major in anything, but those skills are going to be valuable no matter where you apply to medical school.
All right, so everybody pre-med then I think should be double majoring in English is what I've learned from this panel, and we'll be telling everyone. So I have, Jim, we got a question about when the panel in May was. I don't know if you want to answer that live or if you want to put that in the chat, but we got a question about that. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat because I have to check.
Okay, thank you, Jim. And then for our last question, the most English department question one could ask, and so that's why I wanted to end with this one, but what are the panelists' favorite books?
I already referenced mine, Light in August.
All right, so we have some Faulkner represented.
Yes, yes.
Right, and so we're a bunch of English majors talking to English majors. So
Yep.
I suppose I have to say Shakespeare or The Sound and the Fury. I'd say anything Jim Phelan has written is pretty much what I keep on my bedside table. But that's such a tough question. I do when I was in I love the American literature. The Great Gatsby, Hemingway, things like that. But I'd say probably one of my favorite book is A River Runs Through It by Norman Maclean, who was an English professor. And just because of the way he captured so well the challenges of family, and the people who you love the most can be the ones you often can't help the most. But just to give you a more modern, I just finished reading the Raymond Philip Marlowe, the Raymond Carver novels. That was I came to those as well. This author created almost a genre, so I read those. So I try to read in all different things. I don't read a lot of stuff about physicians or by physicians, to be honest. So I like a broad range of books like that.
Yeah, so this is a hard question for me too, and I'd say it changes, right? So for a long time I would have answered Jane Austen's Persuasion. Then for a while I would have answered Ian McEwan's Atonement, and maybe for a while I would have, in terms of medical humanities, I think Paul Kalanithe's When Breath Becomes Air is a fabulous book. I've been reading a lot of African American literature recently, and I have Beloved is Toni Morrison's Beloved is something that I read shortly after it came out, and I keep returning to, and I think that's really so rich and valuable. And I'll just mention one other sort of recent find, which is a novel by Valeria Luiselli called Lost Children Archive. And it's this imaginative thing about child migration. So a lot of what you're hearing about on the news these days, she sort of takes up in this brilliant kind of fiction.
I also want to add, one of my favorite physician authors is Atol Gawande, who wrote Better and Being Mortal. Of all of his books, I would say Being Mortal is my favorite because it most closely ties to my being an English major and really connecting with patients and understanding their values as you're considering their management.
Yeah, one of the great things about Being Mortal is the way in which it starts with him sort of learning all these things about mortality and sort of making up for things he didn't learn in medical school. And then the last third of it, he has to deal with it on the personal level with his father. It's just really, really powerful.
Thank you go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no, sorry. Vidhya reminded me, another physician author that I do like very much is Abraham Verghese. Am I saying that right? He wrote My Own Country, but there's a book that Jim and I taught a lot in our undergrad class called The Tennis Partner. And it's funny, it's not his most popular one, and the students honestly didn't like it as much as his other stuff, but I find it to be one of my favorites as well, just because it was a very interesting story about, Abraham Verghese was the attending physician, so he was the expert, and one of his residents he was in the teacher role, but the resident was a former tennis professional, and Abraham Verghese loves tennis, and so the resident was his teacher in that setting, and they developed a very complex relationship. That might be that's one I would recommend as well.
That's always a question that we get asked at these panels, or just generally sort of in the English department. That's like the favorite. I remember when I started my job here, that was the first question the students asked me, and I thought to myself, I should have been prepped for that. Like I should have been prepped for that, but I hadn't thought about it. And and it was kind of like this, like where I was like, oh, I have so many, and so it was just this rush of information. But it's such a wonderful question, and always so great to learn. And so now I have some new stuff to read. So thank you so much. And just thank you again to all of our panelists for being here. Vidhya, John, Jim, thank you so much for this. I feel like I learned so much personally. Now I am really interested in medical humanities and want to know more about this. Not quite to go to med school, but learn more about medical humanities. And I know our students got a ton out of this. So thank you so much for this panel. And thank you to our attendees for coming as well. So have a great night, everybody, and thank you again.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Katie.
Great
Take
to
care.
John, Vidhya, it was great.
Yeah, great to see
Nice
Another
everybody.
panel
meeting
with
you,
you.
Jim, John, Katie, and
Yep.
good to see you again,
Yep.
Susan.
Bye.